Our speaker for this session, Dr. Milind Phadke. Milind has been a very close friend for well over 20 years now, since those wonderful times in BJ Medical College. Um, Milind has been a gold medalist throughout his medical career. He's topped every year in MBBS. He topped MD in medicine. He topped the DM CET entrance, went on to do DM in cardiology, and as expected, passed out with flying colors from KEM Mumbai. We were fortunate to have him as colleague during residency and learned a lot from him. He is now professor of cardiology at Sion Hospital and also runs a large private practice at Dadar. In that sense, he is a rare breed in cardiology, someone who still has a great interest in academics and teaching. He has authored several papers and has recently authored a book titled Cases in Clinical Medicine, Cardiology. Milind, welcome to Homeocon. Milind, if you can unmute yourself and we are good to go.
Yeah, so can you hear me, Amit?
Yeah, perfectly well.
Hi, good evening, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here with your Homeocon Foundation on this Saturday evening. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm particularly grateful to Amit and all the other organizers for this kind invitation. And Amit has been very kind in his praise, but let me say that, as he has said, we go back a very long way, more than 20 years. Amit was my immediate senior in both MBBS and MD days, and one of the most brilliant, one of the most well-read and astute clinicians that I have ever known. And we have learned tons from him. It's not that he has learned from us, it's the other way around. And he inspired us to take medicine as a profession, MD medicine as a branch, and we went ahead from there. So thank you, Amit. And over the next, say, 35, 40 minutes or so, I have to give a brief overview of ECGs. And ECGs are something that all of us should know about because we see them in and out, and they're available everywhere, right from your big consulting rooms to your hospitals, to your rural and peripheral hospitals. Everybody has access to an ECG machine. And the information that you get out of an ECG is phenomenal. It can give you extra information in common conditions like hypertension and congenital heart disease. It can diagnose life-threatening arrhythmias, ST elevation, myocardial infarction. So good ECG knowledge is a great asset for any practicing doctor. Now, of course, ECG itself is a vast discipline. So over the next half an hour or so, I can only give you a brief overview. So Amit said maybe we may have more such sessions in the future. So my job in this session is predominantly to introduce you to the topic, to give you an idea of what normal ECG waves look like, how they are formed, and just what commonly we use ECGs for and what abnormalities in the QRS complexes and P waves commonly mean. Details of individual conditions, maybe we can go into in subsequent sessions, but this will be just a kind of a bird's eye view so that I don't want to bore you with too much detail right in the first lecture. So I'll start sharing my presentation. Please let me know when you can see it, please.
Yes, Milind, all good.
Okay, all good. So just one more. Yeah. So basically the ECG is a graph, and what it records is electrical potentials and voltages. So as you're all aware, depolarization and repolarization are two processes which take place in the heart, and they are caused by influx and efflux of ions into the myocardial cells. So these fluxes of ions generate electrical currents and potentials. And these potentials are recorded by electrodes which are placed uh, electrodes which are placed on the surface of the body. Now remember that we don't directly record potentials from the heart. These are considerably modified, altered, filtered by the tissues of the thorax, like the bony cage, the air in the lungs, the blood. And the machine itself further simplifies, alters, and filters these currents and magnifies them in certain cases. And then they are recorded on the graph paper. Please also remember that the ECG is an electrical record and it is not a mechanical record. So you cannot get, for example, the ejection fraction from the ECG. It predominantly records potentials of the myocardium, the atrial myocardium and the ventricular myocardium. If you want to record potential from, say, the conducting system, the surface ECG can't do it. For that, you have to put electrolytes inside electrodes inside the heart and record from the conducting system. So Just a brief overview of the cardiac conducting system. The conducting system has two important properties. One, automaticity, and two, conductivity. So automaticity is nothing but the ability of certain cells of the myocardium and the conducting system to act as pacemakers. That is to generate electrical current de novo. And when they generate electrical current, this current can then be conducted to the myocardial tissues. Now, the default pacemaker of the heart is the sinus node or the SA node. Now, other specialized conducting tissues such as the AV node and the His bundle can also act as pacemakers, but normally they are suppressed by the sinus node. So only when the sinus node malfunctions do these tissues act as escape pacemakers. The other important property is conductivity. So conductivity is basically the ability of the cardiac tissues and the conducting system to conduct impulses fast or slow. Now, when the impulse comes from the sinus node through the atria to the AV node, there is naturally a delay. Nature has programmed a delay over there, and that is called the AV delay. So the AV node has conducting properties which are a little slower. So this one is decremental conduction. And then from the AV node to activate the rest of the ventricle, the Purkinje system conducts impulses very, very, very fast. So from the point at which the impulse leaves the AV node to reach the Purkinje fibers, to reach from the endocardium to the epicardium hardly takes any time at all. So the main delay for impulse conduction is the AV node. Now, most commonly we take 12 lead ECGs, but in certain situations like the ICU or in operating rooms, when the patient is under anesthesia or in our cath labs, we don't take full 12 lead ECGs. There we just use monitoring systems, and in that we just connect about 5 leads and we just get 2 rhythm strips. In these cases, the purpose of the ECG is not to make a cardiac diagnosis, not for example to diagnose a bundle branch block or left ventricular hypertrophy. Here we are predominantly interested in monitoring the rate and the rhythm. So these ECGs are only used for that purpose. Now, remember that there are 12 ECG leads I talked about. So 6 of these are limb leads and 6 of these are precordial leads. So now the 6 limb leads are recorded from the 4 limbs. So you place electrode clips in the 4 limbs and the machine will record them. I won't go into details of what exactly is done, but suffice it to say that these 6 leads record electrical activity along the frontal plane of the body. That means the coronal plane of the body. And by convention, each lead has a negative terminal and a positive terminal, and the axis of the lead is said to be in the direction of the positive terminal. So for example, lead 1, this is negative, this is positive. So the axis of lead 1 is from here to here. So this is taken as 0 degrees. So when you calculate the axis, when you talk about the axis in the coronal plane, this reference to the left of the patient is 0. When you come down here, it is 60 plus 90 plus 120, this is plus 180. And when you go into these two quadrants, you again start from here and then you give a negative axis. So there is a negative numbering done. So this is minus 30, minus 60, minus 90, minus 150, and this comes back to 180. So axis which is any axis which are in these two quadrants are negative, axis which are in these two quadrants are positive. So each lead has a specific axis. Lead 1, 2, and lead 3, they respectively have axis of 0, 60, and 90. So their positive terminals are directed to the left, as you can see. Same for lead AVF. Axis is 90, the positive terminal of the lead is directed downwards. AVL, the axis is minus 30, and AVR is a unique lead. You can see that its direction is opposite all the other limb leads. So this looks towards the cavity of the heart. So by and large, it records the electrical activity from which is going on from an angle which is completely opposite to that of the other leads. So after this, we should go on to the precordial leads. So the precordial leads are actually, there are 6 chest leads or precordial leads. So these are electrodes which are stuck or which are applied to the anterior surface of the chest wall, and they record signals coming from the posterior part, that is from the heart, and which travels anteriorly through the chest wall to these leads. So while the limb leads record potentials in a coronal plane, the chest leads or the precordial leads record potentials in a horizontal anteroposterior plane. So there are conventionally 6 leads, but you can have up to 9. You start here in the 4th intercostal space, just to the right of the midline, and then go leftward, leftward, leftward till you reach the anterior axillary line. There's a standard way of recording the ECGs, which you can see in this table. So you can go up to leads V9. You can also have right-sided leads in patients with dextrocardia, but conventionally a standard 12-limb 12 lead ECG will have these 6 recorded leads. So this is a normal 12 lead ECG. There are certain number of interesting things that you will notice in this. The first thing is that, of course, you will see the 12 leads. Leads 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL, AVF, V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. So these are the 12 leads. In addition, you get what are known as rhythm strips. Now, rhythm strips are nothing but the same electrical tracings, but they are recorded for a longer duration throughout the paper. They are very useful in interpreting cardiac arrhythmias because in every lead over here, you can see you have only 3 or 4 QRS complexes. So certain arrhythmias may not, for certain arrhythmias, 3 or 4 complexes may not be sufficient to make a diagnosis. So for them, you record rhythm strips or what is known as long lead. So most commonly, you take long lead 2, and sometimes you may take V1 or even V5 as has been done in this case. So in a typical ECG paper, you will get these 12 leads and you will get at least one long lead, most commonly long lead 2. Right? So these are, as I said, the rhythm strips. So now we come to the ECG paper. You've just seen what the ECG paper looks like. Let's magnify it. Let's blow it up further and see. So you can see that the ECG paper is divided into a number of small squares. And all over the world, the standard is that each small square is both 1 millimeter across and 1 millimeter vertically. And 5 small squares make up a large square. So after every 5 small squares, you will have a dark line, both vertically as well as horizontally. So one large square is made up of 5 small squares by 5 small squares. Now on the horizontal axis of the ECG paper, you have time, and on the vertical axis, you record voltages or potential. The standard paper speed of the ECG is 25 millimeters per second. This is set as default in all machines. Now, as far as time is concerned on the horizontal axis, when you go ahead by one small square, that means you have gone ahead by 40 milliseconds. When you go ahead by 5 small squares or one large square, you have gone ahead by 40 into 5, that is 200 milliseconds. So one small square is 40 milliseconds, one large square is 200 milliseconds, and therefore 5 large squares constitute 1 second, 200 into 5. When you go up, one small square or 1 millimeter constitutes 1 millivolt. So that is the calibration that is which is standard. And in an ECG machine, if you have an ECG, this is what will be recorded. If you want to record a different speed or a different calibration or standardization, you will have to set the machine accordingly. So this is the calibration. So at the beginning of the ECG tracing, you must have seen in the ECG before, you have this mark. So this is the calibration mark. So this calibration mark should be 10 small squares tall. So that is normal calibration. When it is 10 small squares tall, it means that 1 millimeter corresponds to 1 millivolt. And this is what is recorded in most ECGs. Sometimes if you have very big complexes which are going out of the ECG paper and you want to reduce the size of the complexes, then you may reduce or increase the standardization. So you may take half standardization. On the other hand, if you have very small complexes and you want to blow them up a little bit to see them better, then you can do double standardization in which you magnify the size of the complexes. But this is what is the default for the ECG machines. I'm going into this in some details so that you get an idea when you look at the ECG paper next what exactly you're seeing. Now the ECG tracing itself, which is the crux of the talk, is made up of what are known as waves, complexes, segments, and intervals. Now what is a wave? The wave is nothing but a deflection from the baseline. So it can be a positive wave when it is above the baseline, or it can be a negative wave when it is below the baseline. 2 or more waves make up a complex. And the only complex that we really analyze on the ECG is the QRS complex. Then the isoelectric segment between 2 waves or 2 complexes is the portion is known as a segment. Why isoelectric? Because it is flat. There is no electrical activity over here. So this represents a phase when neither depolarization nor repolarization is really going on. So there are 2 such intervals or segments, the PR interval and the ST segment. And one more interval that is commonly measured in the ECG is the QT interval, from the beginning of the Q wave to the QRS complex to the end of the T wave. So these are the 5 or 6 waves and intervals that we have to analyze when we look at any ECG tracing. Sometimes you may also get U waves, which are secondary waves, which are probably believed to be due to papillary muscle depolarization. They may be important in certain electrolyte disorders like hypokalemia. But for all practical purposes, this is what you have to analyze. So the first thing is, of course, first things first, how do you calculate the heart rate in an ECG? Simple, common question, because without that, you can't go ahead. So the most accurate method is what is known as the 1500 method. How do you go about this method? So what you do is, now you know very well that these are small squares. So you take two QRS complexes. So for this method to work, all the QRS complexes must come at regular intervals. If you have an irregular rhythm like atrial fibrillation, this method won't work. So take two QRS complexes, take the peak of the R waves, and calculate the number of small squares between the R waves. So in this case, there are 38 small squares or small boxes. So 1500 divided by this number, 38 or whatever it may be, will give you the heart rate. So in this case, it is 1500 divided by 38 or 40 beats per minute. So this is very accurate. So this will give you the exact heart rate. If you want to, so just take an example. So what is the heart rate in this ECG? So take one R wave, take the next R wave, calculate the small squares in between. So you can see there are four small squares, 4 plus 5, 9, 9 and 5, 14 and 1, 15. So heart rate is 1500 upon 15, which is 100. Now the 300 method is a kind of a shortcut method if you just want to eyeball the heart rate without being very precise. So for that, in the numerator, instead of 1500, you have 300. And in the denominator, instead of using the number of small squares between two RR complexes, we use large squares. So in this case, you can see if you start exactly at a vertical line, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4. So there are 4 large squares here between the two R waves. So the heart rate is 300 divided by this number 4, which is 75. So this obviously works when you have an exact whole number, which is the difference between the two R, which is the interval between the two R waves. If you have suppose 4 large squares and 2 small squares and 4 large squares and 3 small squares, then it won't work as accurately, but it can give you a very good idea. So by this formula, if you have 6 large squares between the two RR waves, your heart rate is 50, 300 upon 6. Similarly, if you have 5 large squares, it is 60. So just looking at the ECG, you can eyeball and say this heart rate is between 50 and 60, or this heart rate is between 60 and 70, depending upon the number of large squares. So this is a quick method for making a guesstimate. The previous one was an accurate method when you really need the exact heart rate. So I've already talked about the QRS axis. Now, you remember I've talked about the reference system for the leads. So what exactly is the electrical axis? So remember, when the ventricles are getting depolarized, a front of activation is traveling down the length of the ventricles. So what the QRS axis does is that it averages out these potentials during the cardiac cycle, during the depolarization phase, and gives us the net vector. So the net vector is normally directed downwards, leftwards, and anteriorly. So therefore, the normal QRS axis in the cardiac cycle is between -30 to +90. So it is in this quadrant. It is downwards and leftwards. Any axis which is more negative than -30 up to -90 is called left axis deviation. Any axis which is more positive, that means rightwards, than +90 is called right axis deviation up to 180 degrees. And axes which come in this quadrant are called the northwest axis or extreme axis deviation. These occur only in a very few limited conditions. The most common axis deviation that you will see in clinical practice is left axis deviation. Right axis and northwest axis are not so common. They occur in only certain specific conditions, but they can occur. So how do you calculate the axis? So a very simple formula. If you just want to, again, quickly eyeball and say whether the axis is normal or not, you use the quadrant method. For the quadrant method, you look at two leads which are perpendicular to each other. In this case, now remember, the lead one, the axis is 0 degrees. Lead AVF, the axis is 90 degrees. So they are perpendicular to each other. So what you do is you look at the QRS complexes in these two leads. So if the QRS complexes are both predominantly positive in these leads, let's look at this ECG. QRS complex predominantly positive in lead 1, predominantly positive in lead AVF. That means the axis is in this quadrant, it is a normal axis. If it is positive in 1, negative in AVF, then it is the left axis. If it is negative in 1 and positive here, it's the right axis. And if both are negative, it's northwest axis. The next slide will show that better. So this is left axis deviation. So you have a positive QRS complex in 1, but you have a predominantly negative complex in AVF. So this is left axis. Now here 1 has become negative, but AVF continues to be positive. So now this is right axis. And when both are negative, as in this ECG, 1 and AVF, this is extreme or northwest axis deviation. So even if you don't calculate the axis precisely, provided that you have dominant positive or negative waves in 1 and AVF, you can use this method. You can't use it if you don't have good complexes, if you have only biphasic complexes. But by and large, this will suffice. Now coming to the waves proper. Now the P wave represents atrial activity. It represents depolarization of the atrial myocardium. And because the atrial mass is considerably less than the ventricular mass, the P wave is smaller than the QRS complex. The P wave is the net depolarization potential of the right and left atria. And normally the P wave should be less than 120 milliseconds in duration. That means less than 3 small squares in width. And in the limb leads, it should be less than 2.5 millimeters tall. And in the chest leads, it should be less than 1.5 millimeters tall. So the two important things that you can diagnose from the P wave are: number one, arrhythmias, of course, by virtue of its relation to the QRS complex, and second, atrial enlargement. So for that, we use P waves in predominantly two leads, lead 2 and lead V1. So if you have left atrial enlargement, I'm sorry, if you have right atrial enlargement, you will get a tall peak P wave in lead 2. While if you have left atrial enlargement, you will get a broad and slurred P wave in lead 2, and you will get a dominant negative P terminal force in lead V1. So this is known as the P terminal force. So you have a positive wave and then you have a slurred prominent negative P wave. So this is a sign which you will see very commonly in clinical practice, especially in patients with essential hypertension or patients who have enlarged left atria and left ventricles. So P terminal force is something that you will see practically daily if you are interpreting ECGs. So normally the P wave should be positive in lead 2 and it should usually be inverted in AVR. Remember, AVR is a lead which looks away from all the other leads. So most things are inverted in AVR as compared to the other leads. Now coming to the next interval, which is the PR interval. Dr. Amit, I'm clear now up till now. Is there something that you would like to add or?
No. You're very clear. Maybe you can go a tad bit slower.
Okay, I'll go slower.
Thanks.
So now this is the PR interval. So how do you see the PR interval? So to calculate the PR interval, you start from the beginning of the P wave and you go to the beginning of the QRS complex, the first wave of the QRS complex. So this interval is the PR interval. So the normal PR interval should be between 3 to 5 small squares or 120 to 200 milliseconds, right? Now, why is the PR interval important? The PR interval is important because it gives you the state of the atrioventricular conduction. How soon or how slowly the impulse is going from the atria to the ventricles through the AV node and the His-Purkinje system. So if the PR interval is prolonged, if it is more than 200 milliseconds, it indicates that there is a delay. That means there is an abnormality of the conduction system, the AV conduction system, and the impulse conduction through from the atrium to the ventricles has slowed down. So it's very important to recognize this. Some common medications like beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, especially like verapamil and diltiazem, can prolong the PR interval, as can digoxin. Short PR interval is less commonly seen. A short PR interval means that atrioventricular conduction is occurring faster than normal. That means something is causing the ventricles to depolarize ahead of time, earlier than expected. So when can this occur? The commonest condition in which this can occur is known as is what is called an accessory pathway. An accessory pathway is an abnormal specialized conducting tissue or pathway between the ventricles and the atria. So this pathway is present in addition to the normal sinus node in a small minority of people, and the impulse can conduct much faster through this pathway than the sinus node and than the AV node. So the impulse reaches the ventricles through this accessory pathway earlier than normal. Therefore, your PR interval gets shortened in these individuals, and that you can pick up from the ECG. And why is it important? Sometimes this fast conducting impulse can short circuit and it can lead to supraventricular tachyarrhythmias, what is known as the WPW syndrome. If you have heard of it, you must have. So just to give these examples, now look at the PR interval in the first ECG tracing. So you can see it is roughly about 3.5 small squares, that is about 140 milliseconds. So this is a normal PR interval. The next one is a prolonged PR interval. Why? Look at the interval from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS complex. It's 9 small squares. So 40 into 9 is 360 milliseconds. Remember, 120 to 200 is normal. And this is what I was talking about, the WPW syndrome or pre-excitation. Just see there is no PR interval at all actually. So from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS complex, the distance was considerably shorter. So it is just 80 milliseconds. So this is what is known as pre-excitation. So this is what you will get more commonly in clinical practice. This is something seen by arrhythmologists and electrophysiologists. Now coming to the QRS complex. Now, the normal duration of the QRS complex should be 110 milliseconds or less. It should certainly not be more than 3 small squares, or 120 milliseconds. Now, the term QRS complex is a little confusing. The reason being that not every tracing in every lead will have all these three waves, Q, R, and S. Some may not have Q waves, some may not have R waves, or the S wave may be absent. So there are certain definitions we should know as so that we know which wave to label as Q, which R, which S, and so on. So the first negative deflection of the QRS complex after the P wave is by conventional called the Q wave, called the Q wave. The first negative deflection. If you don't have a negative deflection, if your QRS complex starts with a positive wave, then you have no Q wave. Then it's just R. Similarly, the first positive deflection that follows the Q wave is known as the R wave. Then the second positive deflection of the QRS complex is called an R dash wave. And the first negative or downward deflection after the R wave is called the S wave by definition. So I'll show you how this works actually when we analyze complexes. So these are a few examples of QRS morphology, and you can see that actually QRS complexes are seen only in a minority of patients. So now look here. So this first negative wave is the Q wave. So it's called the Q wave. This is a tall R wave, so it's given a capital letter. So the first positive wave after the Q wave by definition is an R wave. And the first negative wave after an R wave is called an S wave. So this is the QRS complex. The R is written capital because it is much, much, much more taller than the Q and the S. Now see here. Now here there is no negative deflection to start the QRS complex. So there is no Q wave. The first thing that you have is a positive deflection. So by definition, this is an R wave. And the first negative deflection after the R by definition is an S wave. So you have an RS complex. So similarly, you have RS here, but small r because it's a small complex. Now here, this QRS complex has only one wave, and it's a dominant broad negative wave. So in such cases, it is called a QS wave. Similarly, you may have dominant R waves only and no negative waves at all. Then it is called a monophasic R wave. Then this is QR. There is no S here. Small q, tall r, and so on. So once you get these definitions in mind, you know exactly how to label a QRS complex. Now, just before we go to what the QRS complex looks like in the precordial lead, we should know how ventricular depolarization goes down from the atria into the ventricles. Instead of going into too many complexities, it is best to remember that there are basically two directions, two movements. The initial part of ventricular depolarization is from the left to the right of the interventricular septum, which occupies only a small part. But most of the depolarization occurs downwards to the left and anteriorly. So this is an initial small transient vector to the left, but most of the depolarization occurs in this direction. So only the initial part of the QRS complex is caused by this vector, while the bulk of the QRS complex is caused by this vector. Now I will remind you, lead V1 is located on the right of the chest wall. Lead V6 is located almost in the anterior axillary line. So if you have, suppose now this signal is being recorded by both leads simultaneously. So this initial small signal is traveling towards V1. So therefore it will give a small positive deflection in V1, while its opposite V6 is here and the signal is going away. So it will give a dominantly negative deflection in V6. And when the bulk of the muscle gets activated, the large vector now is in the direction of V6 and away from V1. So now you will have a large negative wave in V1 and a dominant positive wave in V6. So therefore, normally the QRS complex is such that it is predominantly negative in V1 and predominantly positive in V6. This you will see in all normal ECGs. So you can see the CCG. So look at the QRS complex. There is a small R wave here initially, and there is a deep S wave. And this is known as the normal adult progression of the QRS complexes. So as you go from V1 to V6, as the leads become more and more leftwards, the R wave starts becoming bigger, the S wave starts becoming smaller. The transition is typically between V3 and V4. Beyond V3 or V4, the R dominates and the S is small. So this is normal adult progression of QRS complexes from V1 to V6. And this is something that you should look for when you analyze any ECG. What do you look for in the QRS complex and what can you diagnose? You can look at the morphology, the duration, as well as the voltage. And you can diagnose conduction abnormalities, chamber enlargement and hypertrophy, old infarction, and some metabolic effects as well. Just to give you a few quick examples. Now see, this is a broad QRS. You can see that the width of the QRS is more than 3 small squares. So a width greater than 120 milliseconds is abnormal. and sometimes it can be a normal variant. It only indicates conduction system, indicates delay through the in conduction through the ventricular muscle. So a right bundle branch block or a left bundle branch block is basically a conduction delay. It does not always indicate myocardial pathology. Many normal people can have a conduction delay if one of the bundles is blocked. It becomes abnormal only if it is associated with certain specific abnormalities. Or it can also be present in certain disease conditions. So just to give you an example, sorry, the labeling is wrong here. It is upside. This should be LBBB. So this is a broad QRS. You can see that the QRS is very broad here, more than 3 small squares. So this is what is known as an LBBB pattern: negative in 1, positive in 1, and V6, negative in V1. This is what is known as an RBB pattern. As I said, I have mislabeled. So this is again a very, very broad QRS. As you can see, these are not normal appearing QRS. So this is an R dash pattern in lead V1 with a tall R wave and a very broad QRS. And you have a prominent slurred S wave in V6 and lead 1, which should not be there. So this is what is known as an RBBB pattern. Now we come to the ST segment. Now ST segment in T wave predominantly represent ventricular repolarization. There are 3 important points about repolarization that you should remember. Number 1, repolarization lasts much longer than depolarization. Depolarization is very quick. It corresponds to the upstroke of the action potential. Then the sequence of depolarization is opposite to that of depolarization. That means the part which depolarizes last gets repolarizes first. And the strength of the waves, the potentials is small. So therefore, the T wave, which is the major repolarization wave, is broader than the QRS complex because repolarization is longer, but it is smaller in potentials because the voltages involved are much smaller. So this is the repolarization part of the QRS complex, the ST segment and the T wave. Now, first we talk about the ST segment. ST segment is probably the most important thing for a cardiologist in clinical practice because of that we diagnose ST segment myocardial infarction and ischemia. So the ST segment is the isoelectric line between the end of the QRS complex and the beginning of the T wave. This junction between the QRS and the ST is sometimes also known as the junction or the J point. And this ST segment normally should be horizontal, isoelectric, and it should not be more than 1 millimeter above or 1 millimeter below the baseline. So this is the baseline. The TP segment is the baseline. So this is a normal ST segment. T is flat, it is horizontal, and it is exactly at the level of the baseline of the TP segment. Now, ST elevation myocardial infarction, the condition which we are all so familiar with and so scared of. In STH segment myocardial infarction, see this STs here. See these STs here. So this is the baseline, the TP segment, and you can see how much the ST is elevated. It is almost 3-4 millimeters above the baseline. So this is ST segment elevation. On the other hand, in ST segment depression, you have an ST segment which goes below the baseline. So again, always remember that your reference is the TP segment, this part. So see here that the ST segment is below the baseline. This is also a marker, can be a marker of ischemia or of unstable angina. Now, myocardial infarction is not the only cause of ST elevation. There are so many other conditions like pericarditis, early repolarization. But when you see ST elevation, at least you must consider the possibility of myocardial infarction, because if this diagnosis is missed, it can be extremely detrimental for the patient. Always at least think of it, and there are ways of distinguishing myocardial infarction from all these other causes of ST elevation. Maybe we can take them up in subsequent lectures. Similarly, ST depression can also be due to ischemia, that is unstable angina or non-ST segment elevation myocardial infarction, but it can have other causes as well. So the clinical situation and the pattern of ST depression helps you distinguish between various causes like hypertrophy or medications or electrolyte abnormalities. Sometimes even in intracranial bleeds or subarachnoid bleeds, you can get STT segment changes. So the normal T wave has a slightly asymmetric morphology. So the ascending limb of the T wave is shallow, the contour is rounded and smooth, and the descending limb is relatively steep. And the amplitude or the height of the T wave should be usually less than 5 millimeters. And by and large, the direction of the T wave goes with the QRS complexes. So leads which have positive QRS complexes usually will have positive or upright T waves and vice versa. T waves are generally inverted in lead AVR. They are usually upright in left-sided leads like 2, AVF, and all these V4, V5, V6, and sometimes they can be inverted in lead V1. So the orientation of the T waves is also important. And as I said, T-wave inversions can have a number of causes. We always think of ischemic heart disease first when we get a patient with T-wave inversions, but they can be seen in other conditions, for example, ventricular hypertrophy, intracranial pathology, pericarditis. Then you can get what are known as secondary SCT changes in patients with, T-wave inversions in patients with bundle branch blocks. Then we can get them in conditions like pulmonary embolism, then intracranial pathologies. So all these can cause T-wave inversions, and sometimes T-wave inversions can also occur normally. For example, young females sometimes have T-wave inversions which are shallow in the chest leads, or young children before the age of 7 or 8 years can have T-wave inversions leads V1, V2, V3. This is known as a juvenile pattern, and these are normal. So I have here 4 ECGs of T-wave inversion just to give you a bird eye view of how the same, a similar appearance can have different etiologies. So take this ECG. Now you can see that just have a look at the QR at the ECG, and you can see that there are T-wave inversions here in leads V1, V2, and even up to lead V3. This was a child of about 5 or 6 years of age, and this is what is known as the juvenile T-wave inversion pattern. Now, this patient you can see has T-wave inversions almost in leads V4, and they're quite prominent. This was a 45-year-old male who presented with chest pain. So this patient had ischemic T-wave inversions, acute ischemia. So this patient was a patient of uncontrolled hypertension who came with this ECG. Now, please note that the QRS voltages are very tall. This patient had left ventricular hypertrophy, and the T-wave inversions that you can see here in leads V5, V6, and leads 1 and AVL are secondary to the left ventricular hypertrophy. This is known as the LVH with train pattern. So sometimes these may be confused for ischemic T-wave. But if you look at the clinical situation and you see that the patient has tall QRS complexes and uncontrolled hypertension, then you will refrain from easily diagnosing ischemia in such cases. And this is one condition which is commonly missed. Again, there are T-wave inversions in the anterior leads. Time and again, people will label this as anterior wall ischemia. But remember, look at these Q waves over here. Look at these T inversions here. This is a patient of acute pulmonary embolism. So acute pulmonary embolism can also present as T-wave inversions in the anterior leads. So your experience, the pattern of T inversion, and the clinical scenario in which T inversions occur can be all very, very useful clues in reaching a good diagnosis, the correct diagnosis. Now we have talked about inverted T waves, but sometimes T waves can be extremely tall. So these are known as hyperacute T waves. And it is an important early sign of an ST elevation myocardial infarction. As you know, an STEMI occurs when a coronary artery gets abruptly occluded. So when a coronary artery gets abruptly occluded, ST elevations are expected to occur, but sometimes even before occurrence of ST elevations, you can get hyperacute T waves. So these may be the first signs of infarction. So you take the ECG and you say, "Arey, there is no ST elevation here, so this patient doesn't have an infarct." But look at the T waves. So you can see an ECG here put down over here. So you can see how tall, they're much taller than the QRS complexes, and they are broad based. So these are hyperacute T waves in the patient who are presented to the ER with acute chest pain. And subsequently, this patient turned out to have ST elevations and an occluded LAD which was open. It may also be seen sometimes in hyperkalemia. Again, they are an important ECG sign of hyperkalemia. So also look for tall T waves when you also look for inverted T waves. Now the QT interval is very fascinating to the cardiologists and electrophysiologists. Why is the QT interval important? The QT interval represents depolarization as well as repolarization, and it is measured from the beginning of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave. And you should check it in all leads, and you should take the lead which has the longest QT interval. Now remember that the QT interval is not a fixed entity. It varies with heart rate. So at faster heart rates, the QT interval normally shortens. At slower heart rates, the QT interval normally lengthens. So we never express the QT interval in isolation. We always talk about the corrected QT interval. Corrected for what? Corrected for the heart rate. And how do you correct it for the heart rate? So you use certain formulae. The most commonly used formula is the Bazet correction or the Bazet formula. In that, you measure the QT interval on the ECG. You know how to measure it. Beginning of the Q wave to the beginning of the QRS complex to the end of the T wave. So you have to express this in the numerator in milliseconds and divide that by the RR interval in seconds. So take the RR interval in seconds, not in milliseconds. Take the square root and divide the QT interval by that. So QT in milliseconds divided by square root of the RR in seconds will give you a corrected QT interval. And we never talk about the isolated QT interval. We always talk about QTC. And why is it so important? It is important because, especially in patients with a very long QT interval, there is a predisposition for some dangerous ventricular tachyarrhythmias to occur. And particularly one tachyarrhythmia which we are scared of is what is known as polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. And this combination of prolonged QT with polymorphic ventricular tachycardia is a life-threatening condition. It's called Torsades-de-Pointes. And if this arrhythmia is not recognized and treated, it can often be fatal for the patients. Now, you will say, does QT interval occur in clinical practice? It occurs very commonly. And one common condition in which it occurs is the CCU, or in patients on certain medications. So patients with electrolyte disorders, patients having bradycardia, and medications, some of the commonly used medications in clinical practice, especially used in combination, can prolong the QT interval. I'll give you some examples. Your macrolide antibiotics, then your quinolone group, some of your quinolone group of antibiotics, fluoxetins, then some of your non-sedating antihistaminics like terfenadine or astimazole, especially if you have a patient with a respiratory tract infection and you give him something like a cetirizine or a terfenadine in combination with a quinolone, or you give a quinolone and a macrolide, these patients can dramatically prolong the QT interval and develop these life-threatening arrhythmias. Another common antiarrhythmic drug for those of you who have worked in ICUs is amiodarone. Now, amiodarone is like, sub-bimari ek ilaj for supraventricular tachyarrhythmias. You don't think of anything else, you can't think of anything else, you give amiodarone. And so amiodarone, though it is an effective medication, it can cause dramatic QT prolongation, and we have had cases who have presented with life-threatening arrhythmias. So never forget to look at the QT interval, especially in a sick patient, a patient who is likely to have metabolic disorders, a patient who is likely to have fever or hypothermia for that matter, a patient who is on multiple medications. So do look at the QT interval in the ECG. So this is an example of a prolonged QT interval. Now, in every case, even if you're not able to measure the QT interval, a rough rule of the thumb is that the QT interval should be less than half of the RR interval. So here, if the RR interval is about, say, 20 small squares or 22 small squares, then the QT interval should be less than 11 small squares. Here, obviously, the QT interval is prolonged. It is much more than half of the RR interval. And this patient later on went on to develop this dangerous ventricular tachyarrhythmia, which I talked about earlier, Torsades-de-Pointes. I will not say the French pronunciation, it's difficult to pronounce. Torsades-de-Pointes or something. So just to summarize the intervals that which we measure on the ECG, the PR interval should be 120 to 200 milliseconds, the QRS duration, which should be less than 120 milliseconds, and the QT interval, which should be less than 450 to 460 milliseconds in males or females. So at the end of all this, how do you report an ECG? So now you have seen all the waves, you have analyzed all the complexes. So ECG reporting should be systematic. It should start with the patient's, obviously the patient's demographic details, age and the gender. Then it is always good to have a brief clinical profile so that somebody who analyzes the ECG later knows why the ECG was taken. This is something we never see on the ECG paper. We only get ECGs for reporting. Then you go with a systematic interpretation of the waves and intervals. You start with the rate, the rhythm, the axis, P wave, PR interval, QRS complex, QT and ST and T wave. And then you give an overall impression. What is your final interpretation based on all these findings? And then you can give an advice in clinical plan. So this is the ECG reporting system that I commonly use. So you can see you have the patient's name and all those details. We start systematically the heart rate, the rhythm, and all the things that I have described. And then we give a final impression. In case the patient, you know the past history of the patient. For example, this patient had an old inferior wall myocardial infarction with an angioplasty done. So this patient had Q waves in leads 3 and AVF, the inferior leads. So this patient therefore had an old evolved inferior wall MI. So we mentioned that over here. So at the end, I would just like to leave you with some thoughts, and my thoughts about ECG are, as follows. As I said before, it represents a mechanical, an electrical view of the heart rather than mechanical function. It is not going to tell you, what the ejection fraction of the patient is. It is not going to give you the exact ventricular size, but it will give you an idea that the ventricle is hypertrophied, that the ventricular and atrium is enlarged. It will tell you that there is possibly an old myocardial infarction here. So it will give you so much information which can lead you to derive mechanical information from it, and it will give a lot of add-ons to your other investigation. But the other thing is that a normal ECG, again, a common mistake made, the ECG is normal, that means the patient's heart is normal. So this is not the right conclusion to draw. The commonest example is something we see in clinical practice, ischemic heart disease. So many patients with ongoing anginas have normal ECGs, completely normal ECGs. So, the doctor phones us or the patient phones us, doctor, I have classical chest pain, but my ECG is completely normal, so there's nothing wrong with me. I don't want to get admitted. But remember, 50% of patients with unstable angina and non-ST elevation myocardial infarction can come with an initially normal ECG. Even in patients with ST elevation myocardial infarction, if the ECG is done very early, it may be completely normal. Then another example where not everything is reflected in the ECGs, mild pathologies. For example, if you have a very small ASD, if you have a very small VHD or a PDA, if you have only mild ventricular hypertrophy, if you have only mild mitral stenosis or regurgitation, these things may not be picked up in the ECG. So the ECG in those patients may be completely normal in presence of a significant structural heart disease. And for any ECG finding, you must take the sensitivity and specificity into account. So we say that the ECG is useful in diagnosing ventricular hypertrophy. For example, we have a lot of criteria for left ventricular hypertrophy, Rommel test, Romanov, etc. Cornell, etc., etc. But remember that the sensitivity and the specificity of the criteria matters. Most of the, for example, ECG criteria for LVH diagnosis are very insensitive. So they will be present only in 30% of patients with LVH. So if you look at the ECG and say, well, there is no LVH here, so this patient doesn't have left ventricular hypertrophy, you may be wrong in 70% of the cases. So every finding has a sensitivity and specificity. No single finding is usually diagnostic. And most importantly, especially in the case of arrhythmias, some of the ECG abnormalities may just not be present. To give you a classical example, a patient has a supraventricular tachycardia, and by the time the patient comes to the hospital, the tachycardia may have reverted. So the patient may have completely normal ECG. Or a patient with AV conduction abnormality, like for example, complete AV block. The complete AV block will be present only at certain times during the day. If you do the ECG at a particular period of time, the AV conduction may be normal. So in these patients, you may have to record longer ECGs known as Holter or 24-hour rhythms. Then some patients may have intermittent chest pain and ischemia. So the patient has angina at night. At that time, if you had taken the ECG, you may have got an ST depression. But when he comes to your OPD or the clinic in the morning, the ECG is completely normal. So normal ECG doesn't mean that the patient's heart is normal and he has no cardiac pathology, he or she. And an abnormal or a slight deviation from the normal doesn't necessarily diagnose a specific structural pathology. If we keep these limitations in mind, the ECG can, give you a wealth of information which maybe we can analyze more and more in our subsequent coming talks. So thank you very much, Dr. Amit, and it's been a pleasure. And I hope I've been able to at least give you a brief overview, everybody a bird's eye view of, what one must look for when one is dealing with an ECG.
Thanks, Dr. Milind. That was really very helpful and instructive. Teaching ECG, I guess, especially online, is extremely challenging. And I can say that you've really given us all very good insights on how to begin to understand and analyze ECGs. So if I can request any questions, please unmute yourself, and Dr. Milind might be happy to take a few questions. So maybe I can start, Milind. Milind, sometimes you get ECGs where computerized reports are already, some comments are already made on the ECG strip. So what's your view on how reliable they are or otherwise?
Actually, if you look at the computer report right at the top of the ECG paper, one part of the computer report is that it will give you the interval, the PR interval, the QT interval, the QTC. Now, in most cases, those are quite reliable because they are directly measured by the computer. But the interpretations given by the computer are often hopelessly wrong. I mean, we have had computers diagnosing anterior wall myocardial infarctions with normal ECGs. We have had computers diagnosing bundle branch blocks when they were none. So just turn a blind eye to that part of the interpretation. They're usually extremely unreliable. The intervals are reliable. The computer's interpretation of the pathology is totally unreliable.
Thanks. For younger students, meaning maybe fresh graduates and so on, what would you recommend on how important ECGs are and how to go about studying them for an OPD-based practice?
I would say look at as many ECGs as you can. I mean, ECGs are really not learned from books. You should know the basic, the theoretical basis of ECGs from books. But we really learned ECGs when we started looking at more and more ECGs. So maybe if they can shadow somebody who has a lot of ECGs in practice, or maybe the hospital to which they go if they can sit in the OPD or go to the ICU and start looking at ECGs, when they look at 20, 40, 50, 100, 150 ECGs, automatically certain things will start registering in their mind. So it's just a matter of practice. The theoretical basis, even if they read the chapter in Brownwall, that's more than enough. But I think looking at more and more ECGs is the key. That's how we all have learned. I think, Amit, you'll agree with that.
Yeah, certainly. Any questions? Don't be shy. Ask anything, anything that you like. I'm sure all of us, and especially I'm encouraging the younger crowd.
Yeah, please feel free. No problem. If I can answer, I will. If I can't, I'll read about it and I'll answer next time.
Yes, you mentioned Digitalis as one of the remedies that you use based on a reading from an ECG. Are there other remedies that come up significantly that can just be attributed to the deviations on an ECG strip?
Yes, some of your tricyclic antidepressant medications, which you use, the psychiatrists use, they can cause prolongation of the QRS complexes. Then beta blockers and other AV nodal blockers like your non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blockers, they can cause a lot of AV blocks in the ECG. So often, we get patients, elderly patients who have been on long-standing beta blockers, they come with very slow heart rates or they come with AV conduction blocks, and we look at the prescription and we find that a beta blocker is going on. Then medications which specifically cause electrolyte abnormalities like hypokalemia can show up on the ECG. So yes, I mean, in terms of medications, there are quite a lot of and of course there is a long list of QT prolonging medicines which I talked about. A lot of medications do show up. A lot of toxins can also show up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Milind?
Yeah.
This is not directly related to the ECG, but like as an OPD practice, you have somebody who you suspect that probably there's an oncoming MI, and you see certain ECG changes that of course prompt you, and when you're in a comfortable city like Pune, you will not handle them in your OPD. I mean, I know most of us don't. We rush them off to an ICU setup. What are the most important tests? We keep hearing about this TROP-T test. So can you give us some practical insights, like as an OPD practitioner, what should be the red flag one should look out for? And which are the cases that absolutely need to be under specialist care and should not be mistaken for? If you just take us through that little slowly, so that I think it's also very important to all the younger doctors, and it will help us take it from a practical angle. I know I keep troubling Amit for this very often. See, easy access. I just click a snap of the ECG and SOS call him. Help me out on this.
Okay. So see, troponins are cardiac enzymes which are normally present in the myocardial cells. And only when the cell undergoes necrosis to a significant extent are the enzymes released in the blood. So when you have acute occlusion of an artery and you have ischemia which is sufficient to cause cell necrosis, that is the point of time at which troponins will be released in the blood. But please bear in mind that it takes some time for the troponins to go up. So from the time of artery occlusion to a detectable rise in the troponin is at least 4 to 6 hours. So very often what happens is the patient gets chest pain, comes to you in the OPD, we do a troponin, the troponin is normal. Because there isn't enough time for the cell to get injured for the enzymes to leak into the blood and give a detectable rise as that can be measured in the lab. So if the first ECG, first enzyme set is normal and you're still strongly on the basis of the clinical history and risk factors suspecting angina, it's best to repeat the troponin after 3 to 4 hours. Now, we diagnose coronary artery disease not only on the basis of enzymes, but on the pre-test probability, the presence of risk factors, and the clinical history that the patient comes with. So if a patient has come with very typical angina, I would not rely only on troponins. I would go by my clinical judgment. The clinical judgment is most important. Second comes troponin, the ECG, and all other things. So if you are convinced that this is typical angina, so for example, a 35-year-old lady comes to you with chest pain, she may describe it as very typical angina. She's non-diabetic, non-hypertensive. Probably this patient, even if one troponin is normal, you would accept. But a 55-year-old diabetic comes to you with a typical onset of chest pain. Even if the first troponin is normal, you would be very careful. You would probably ask them either to get admitted at least for observation or repeat the troponin after say 4 to 6 hours. or at least get an ECG done after 1 or 2 hours again. So if the pre-test probability of having ischemic heart disease is high, I would investigate these patients much more thoroughly, and I would not rely on a single troponin. The other thing is, of course, this new high sensitivity troponin that has come up. So all the labs have started doing this HS-trop. Now the problem with HS-trop is that it is oversensitive. So it is diagnosing ischemia where it should not diagnose. So it's overdiagnosing. So I always specifically ask, unless the patient is in the first 2 or 3 hours where it is more sensitive, beyond that I always ask for normal troponins. So troponins are important. The universal definition of myocardial infarction, which has been put up, requires troponin as the primary criteria for diagnosis. But you must bear in mind all these limitations. And there are certain conditions in which troponins may be elevated without ST elevation myocardial infarction. For example, if the patient has chronic renal disease, patient with pericarditis, or these kind of things. So there are these conditions you may get troponin elevations even without infarction. So take the whole clinical picture into account, the typical nature of the pain, the risk factors, and the time duration of doing troponin. And then after that, putting all this together should give you the complete picture. I think Amit will add something to this.
Thanks for that.
Amit, you would add something?
No, I'm good, Milind. Any other questions? Milind, I remember Dr. Vaishnav used to tell us when he was working with a cardiologist before he joined BJ Medical that one day, they'd admitted a lady for angina, and in the afternoon the cardiologist just came and heard her symptoms for about 2-3 minutes and just discharged her. And these people are saying, what happened? And another day, they had seen somebody on OPD basis, a 40-year-old guy with a family history of young cardiac death, coming up with questionable symptoms, and the cardiologist had admitted him, somebody that they were going to just, send away with some pantoprazole or something. So that is when they asked the cardiologist, about these two conflicting things, where on one day they felt that the patient certainly deserves admission for angina evaluation, and on another day when they had decided that this is just dyspepsia. So the cardiologist told him, Dr. Vaishnav, angina is my bread and butter. I know how to recognize it well enough only by symptoms. ECGs and other things are secondary. So I just was reminded of that caveat.
No, that's a very good message, very important message. And, history taking trumps all. Just take the time to listen to the patient, you'll get the diagnosis. Even better than all the ECGs and troponins in the whole. No question about that.
Any other questions, guys? Okay, I think no further questions. So, Milind, thanks so much once again for sparing your valuable time. And I sincerely do hope that you can take a few more lectures for us. Maybe break down maybe topic by topic so that you can take one topic at greater length. But it will be really useful to all of us, I'm sure. Thanks so much, Milind.
Thank you. Have a great evening, great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. So now may I invite Dr. Sachin. He's going to talk to us about a few cases.
I'll start.
Dr. Sachin Mehta.
I'll start. Amit,
Yeah, just a second.
I'll start.
Yes, Sachin, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Good evening to everybody. In cricket, when the opening batsman does a good job, the rest of the players' job becomes easy. So here, though my name is Sachin, Dr. Milind Phadke has done a job of Sachin Tendulkar and made my job very easy. I'll start my screen sharing, and whatever cardiac cases I have seen at Habbu sir and at my clinic, I'll just share it with you. I'll share my screen. Amit, screen is shared, no?
Yes, all good.
Yes, okay. So I'll start with the basic complaint. What I've seen is mitral valve prolapse, MVP it is called as, when on Doppler it is seen mild MR. The complaint is palpitation, more triggered by stress, anxiety. Young people coming with this complaint, and I have done wonderful job. Look at Habusar also, I've seen many cases. At my clinic, I've solved at least 8 to 10 cases with acid phos 1M, Lordosis 30. I'll just show you what is Lordosis from the books mentions. It is mentioning mitral regurgitation at the heart and palpitation, cyanosis neonatal. Now, what I want to tell you is, I have not just learned this from Habusar, that acid phos 1M and Lordosis gives wonderful results for MVP. I have learned something much more better, and what I have learned is, I have learned that acid phos patients are more bound to have MVPs. When I diagnose by looking at the patient that this man or the female can be acid phos constitutionally coming to me at young age with palpitation, and I may say many times, I'm not wrong, I say get one Doppler done and your Doppler will show MVP, and the patients are so surprised and so they're so happy with the doctor, that doctor, how did you diagnose MVP? I said this was my learning from Habusar. I will just 1 minute, I'll show you how acid phos patient looks. Here I will show you my patient's photograph. See, a patient who is more tall, slim, pointed nose, gray hair, or maybe light hair, brownish golden hair, and thin people with palpitation at the age of young age, they come to you with palpitation complaints. You think of acid phos, and I tell them to go for Doppler, and I have found at least in 10 cases, I have done perfect job. Without Doppler, I could guess that he has mitral valve prolapse. Now this fellow has golden hair also, golden beard also, and mustache also golden. He does not appear thin in the photo, but actually it is he is thin, not seen in the photograph. I'll show you another case of a female. Both the cases are for MVP, treated very well, where allopathic doctors, they use Inderal. Propranolol is the drug of choice, but I have done wonders with their palpitation goes away with this acid phos. I'll just show you now what book mentions. I just wanted to highlight this point: sunken eyes, pointed nose. Now this pointed nose is mentioned only and only, I think out of so many books, it is mentioned only in N.M. Chaudhary's books. By experience, we have seen at Habusar's clinic, most of the acid phos have pointed nose, but it is mentioned in N.M. Chaudhary's book also. And so only Habusar says, read one drug from at least 3 to 4 books. I'll just show you how acid phos patient appears: light hair, brown or golden hair, tall, slender, slim, fair skin, nose, pointed nose. He has dreamy eyes. Now this we have learned from Habusar, that you have to read eyes. You have to see depression. You have to see that anxiety in the eyes, that dreamy eyes. When we have been asking our patients that while reading a book or while watching a TV, your thoughts are wandering, or while working, your thoughts are wandering, and they say yes. Most of the time they say yes. This can be picked up by looking at the eyes. And number 2 is they are forgetful by nature. This is what is in acid phos, and we say, are you forgetful by nature? If you tend to bring 4 things on the market, do you tend to forget 1 or 2 things? And most of the time the answer is yes. Few people say no, I don't forget things, but I make it a point that I write down all the four things and then go to the market. I have experienced this, that those patients who write things and carry to the market, they are most of the times forgetful, and due to that forgetfulness, they make it a point to write. And lastly, one more important point: less body hair in the males, less body hair and milky urine. They've got milky urine. I'll just show you that when you see less body hair in a case of males, in a case of males with pointed nose, fair skin, you think of acid phos. I've got a lot of hair, but a lot of people, particularly acid phos, don't have much body hair. This is what we have learned, what we have seen clinically. And when we diagnose such case, when we diagnose such case and we tell our patients that you might be having mitral valve prolapse, and most of the times the patients are so surprised, so impressed with the doctor. This is what is I've learned from Abu sir, that you need to impress your patients, and they tell us, sir, how did you come to know? Without the Doppler report, how did you come to know? I have always two things to tell him. I am a good homeopath, and number two, I have worked with Abu sir. Two things. I have two things to tell. I have worked with Abu sir and I am a good homeopath. This is what is MVP. What I have seen is acid fast people are more bound to have MVP problem. Solved very easily on just looking at the patient, then diagnosing it with Doppler, stopping their Inderal, and starting many cases they are diagnosed also. But I have stopped Inderal, given our medicine, and it has worked very well. Acid fast 1M, lorosis. Going ahead, I have used very successfully. I'll just show you Naja. I have used very successfully Naja. I have seen many times at Abu Sir's clinic, and in my clinic also I have used very successfully Naja, mainly for stable angina. It can be given for unstable angina also. That angina is a symptom of coronary heart disease, everybody knows. Naja, when the patient says, I've got clutching at the throat, when the patient says, I've got on exertion, I've got clutching at the throat, and Naja has done wonders. I'll just show you the book reference, what books mentions. This is Borik's photo. Left shoulder and arm with anxiety and fear of death, with heart symptoms. There is pain in the forehead and temples. Nowadays, a lot of allopaths have also confirmed that pain in the temples or pain in the forehead is also a symptom of angina. Previously, they used to not believe this symptom, but nowadays they say obviously clutching at the throat is the symptom of angina, but pain in the temples, sometimes pain in the eyes, is also a symptom of angina. I will just go ahead and show you one more book reference for Naja. In the respiratory complaints, they have mentioned this, that this is Borik, grasping at the throat with sense of choking, irritating dry cough dependent on cardiac lesions. This is from N.M. Chaudhary. It has been used with great success in the treatment of diphtheria and angina pectoris. I wanted to just highlight angina. I have done wonderful results with Naja 30 TDS along with constitutional medicine, which we generally practice with Abu Sir, like how Abu Sir follows, and it has given wonderful results. Going ahead, I am just going to do it in a short time. Now, going ahead, I'll just tell you one case. I'll tell you my case. One patient, a young patient of 25 years old, had come to me. When he entered the cabin with a big file, I saw he was a tall, thin, and having very abnormally long hands and long fingers. And he showed me the file and he told me, sir, I have a big problem. 25 years old young guy, thin and tall, and with very long hands, with very long fingers. This is what is observation, what we have learned from Abu Sir. And he said, sir, I have a big problem. He kept the file and I just told him to do this. I'll just show you. I told him to do this. And he did it. And I will just show you a Google photo. I don't have his photograph. And his condition was like this. His thumb was out of the palms. Then number two thing, what I saw was, I showed you, this is again Google picture, not my patient's photograph. Very long hands, abnormally long hands. And lastly, I will show you the symptoms of that disease: long arms and legs and fingers, tall and thin body type, chest sinks in or sticks out, flexible joints, crowded teeth, curved spine. I know most of the seniors must have diagnosed this case, and without looking at his file, I told him, I think you have Marfan syndrome. I told him, I think you have Marfan syndrome. And believe me, he was so surprised that, sir, how did you diagnose without seeing the file? Marfan syndrome, I have just shared my screen a genetic disorder which affects the connective tissues, eyes, skeleton, blood vessels, and it has the maximum damage it can do is to aorta, and it can be a life-threatening disorder. Now, my patient was so surprised and so happy, sir, you did not see the file, and how did you come to know? I have got Marfan syndrome, I have been going from doctors to doctors, somebody suggested your name, so I came to you. Not yet opened the file. I said, I have observed you, and again, I have two things to tell. I am a good homeopath and I have worked with Habbu sir. This is all learned from Habbu sir, that you can diagnose just by looking at the patient. Now, I will just tell you one. Amit,
Sachin, you had a connectivity issue. I think continue.
continue, no? Okay. Now what I want to tell you was Marfan's syndrome. Mythology says something, and I'll just show you my screen. What is mythology? Mythology says Arjun in Mahabharata had very long hands, which used to touch when he used to stand. It used to touch till his knees, and that is why maybe he was the best Dhanurdhar person archery. Edison will not understand who was Arjun, but it is a traditional Indian mythology, and they have a lot of characters, and this man was the best person for archery. That is what this is all learned from Habbu sir. Again, mythology concept also learned from Habbu sir. Now this case I could give very good results, but before the results, the patient was so impressed with me because I diagnosed without seeing the file. And what was the result? I have just shared my screen. The result was he got me 50 patients. Actually, he got me 50 patients, not Marfan's, but some different cases he brought to me, and he brought me 50 cases. Now I have seen this many times, that you treat one piles ka patient and they bring all 10 cases piles ka only. This is a very surprise to me. I always wonder, this piles ke patient ke saath hi utte baithte hai kya? But this man brought me different cases, and just because he was so happy with me that I could diagnose only on looking at the patient. Now I'll just go ahead and I will share one of the case. I'll just share one of the case which I had seen with Habbu sir. We had gone in 1997, that is 24 years before, we had gone to Nasik with Habbu sir for one conference. There was one patient was shown to sir, he was wearing pajama. Now why I am telling you pajama is something specific. I'll just tell you later on. AD sir might not understand what is pajama. So it's a loose type of pant. I have taken photograph of this. This is pajama, right? It is a common dress for many Maharashtrian fellows also, and many old people, they wear this. During conference, one lady doctor came to Habbu sir and she asked Habbu sir that, sir, can I get a live case to you? Habbu sir said yes. He was an old person who was 75 years old. He was brought by sir's permission to the stage, and the lady was about to narrate the case. She had a file in her hand, and she was about to narrate the case. Sir said, "Just hold on. There is a 75-year-old person in front of me, having a short distance walk just from the gate of the auditorium till the stage, and he is having shortness of breath. This is what is the old fellow was breathing slightly heavily." This was first observation by sir. Number two, sir said, now look at his raised JVP. Sir showed everybody by just tilting his neck, and sir showed us, see, look at his raised JVP. We all were surprised with sir's observation, what not sir has seen in 2 minutes. Then sir said, an old patient coming to me with shortness of breath on little exertion, raised JVP. Number three, swelling on the legs. Then everybody was very surprised to see the legs swollen. Lastly, last point sir said, which was a shocking point for everybody, and I can never ever forget this point. And sir said, with gross hydrocele. He had gross hydrocele. So only I told you he was wearing pajama, a loose pant, and there was gross scrotal swelling, gross hydrocele can be seen. And the last benchers from the auditorium just got up and they were so shocked at looking at sir's observation. And sir said, it might be a case of CCF. It can be a case of congestive cardiac failure. Believe me, that lady doctor did not answer anything. She was just looking at with surprise and nodding her head. Yes, yes, it's a case of CCF. Sir gave him some medicine immediately, and later on, we came to know after 2 to 3 months that he was doing very well with sir's medicine. This is what is a good homeopath can do. I can tell you clinically also we can diagnose many things. So I've just written here, Abu sir diagnosed in 2 minutes without seeing the report that it's a case of CCF. This is again pajama. Nana Patekar is wearing. That does not mean that Nana Patekar is our patient, not necessarily for hydrocele. Okay. The editor is an Indian film actor, a character artist. I just wanted to show the pajama. That's all for my presentation. I have learned in cardiac cases, this many cases. I will just give a take-home message that observation is the most important thing, which Habu sir always tells. With a homeopath, you have to be most observant. Number two, one patient is not one patient. For juniors, learn that one patient can bring you 10 patients, 50 patients. Be polite, be simple, be humble, talk good. And for juniors, those who have time, give good time to the patient, give answer to their queries, and develop a good rapport so that they can bring good lot of patients to you. And you need to impress your patients by your knowledge, not by your gadgets, juniors. By your knowledge, you need to impress your patients. And lastly, this is what I have learned from Abu sir: think like an allopath. All our masters like Kent, Herring, Nash, everybody, including Hahnemann, was allopath. And my sir, and again now Amit and his wife, they are also allopath. They think more better and they practice more better homeopathy. So do think like an allopath for any disease, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment, and then practice like homeopathy. You can be very successful in your practice. Now I will just hand over this session to our last batsman, Sachin Khired, who is going to play like Virat Kohli. First player played like Sachin Tendulkar. Now Virat Kohli is coming, and middle order batsman. I did my job. Simple. Thank you. Can I end, Amit?
Thank you, Sachin. Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Now, Sachin will we were supposed to have this talk last Saturday, which was World Homeopathy Day. So Dr. Sachin Khired is going to talk. He's going to present us a few cases as well as something on attribute to Dr. Hahnemann. Sachin, over to you.
Amit, can you hear me? Amit, am I audible? Just confirm.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah. Good evening. It's nice to speak to everybody, and my gratitude and thanks to all my teachers who are on with the session just now. And I'm very happy to also say that Dr. Milind is also staying on for the session. We were supposed to have this last week, which was the 10th of April. It was in memory of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who is the founder of homeopathy. And I think it's very apt on behalf of Homeo Foundation that we just take maybe 5 minutes to really go back to our college days, maybe share about Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, what he has done for homeopathy, because today without him, homeopathy wouldn't exist. So what I have done is not really gone into the history. That was an assignment done by me in college many, many years ago. But I have taken something out of his case books, especially from his Paris case books. And I know for a fact Dr. Eddy must already be knowing this case, and it will be wonderful because we'll see a unique way in which Hahnemann worked. And I think many, many young homeopaths don't really take the trouble to read old literature. And I think it's very, very important to go back to the source books and read and study from there, the thinking process. So my talk is dedicated to remembering Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy. That's a picture portrait of him. I mean, most of the homeopaths are familiar of this picture. There are busts available of Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, German physician. So before I read this case out, this is there in the case books of the Paris 1815. Hahnemann, everybody has different interpretations. Even today, no two homeopaths come to the same conclusion where it comes to a patient. You will see a case and you will say, no, this is not the totality. This is not the PQRS. Hahnemann said this about totality. Kent said that about totality. Bonninghausen said Z about totality. Boger said Y about totality. And they are all different aspects and different facets. And then, of course, there are people who will swear by Hahnemann and say that only Hahnemann's way of taking the case is correct and only Hahnemann's way of analysis is correct. And then there are people who are the Kentian thought who say, no, Kent was the master at analysis. And this, I would call it war, I would call it arguments, are eternal in homeopathy. I am not even coming down to the modern ages. Even if we stick till 1940, I think they had as much controversy and fighting as we have in homeopathy even today as to what is the right way to practice. For all practical purposes, I am around 40 years old. And to anybody who's younger than me and starting in homeopathy, I say the right way to practice homeopathy is the one that gives you results. Simple as that. You carve your own path, you study your own homeopathy, you stick to your basics, you get to attend good doctors, you get to see results, and you learn to grow. That's how the only way to practice. You heard what Dr. Milind had to say about ECGs. There's no easy way. The same thing. You take one ECG, you take 10 ECGs, till you do around 1,000, 2,000 of them, there's going to be no way that you are going to come to terms with it. So unless you sit down and start taking cases and prescribing and working on cases, nothing is going to happen. On that note, let us read this case. And this is how Hahnemann took cases in Paris. So this is a point I'm going to come back to after we finish this case. So he typically writes, and these were his handwritten notes, W, a weakly pale man. So see how he is observant about everything in a few words. 42 years old, constantly kept busy by his business at desk. So there already comes in a personality. A thin, pale man who's always working comes to him on the 27th of December 1815 being ill for 5 days. Like, you know, Hahnemann always wrote down what the patient said. The first evening he became, this is Old English, without manifest cause. See, this is a typical way of Hahnemann writing. Sick and giddy, with much eructations. That's what the patient primarily came. Giddiness, feeling nauseous, and eructations. The following night, he had sour vomiting. The subsequent night, severe eructations. Today, that is the day he's come to Hahnemann, sick eructations of fetid and sourish taste. Now, these are all important homeopathic characteristics. Learn to take the history patiently and accurately. Learning to take the history doesn't mean take 1 hour of history. Let us be very, very clear about that. Learning to take history doesn't mean take 1 hour of history. Learning to take history means take relevant history. Take what the patient says. He felt as if the food lay crude and undigested in his stomach. 6th symptom, he used to make notes of the symptom numbers. In his head, he felt vacant, hollow, confused, and sensitive therein. 7th symptom, the least noise was painful to him. And the 8th symptom, he is of a mild, soft, and patient disposition. Now, if you look at this from modern medicine point of view, one could put down gastritis, one could put down migraine, one could put down acid peptic disease. I mean, we could go through this entire thing, but this is what Hahnemann took as his totality. And I've deliberately taken this simple case because I want you to see the beauty of Hahnemann's prescriptions and how amazingly he would filter out symptoms. And I think this is one of the richest tributes we can give to him, because not many homeopaths take the trouble to see what everybody says. Hahnemann homeopathy, Hahnemann did this for homeopathy, Hahnemann invented homeopathy, Hahnemann made provings, Hahnemann did this. Yes, he did a lot of work. I mean, his life and works is probably a whole day of webinar, and it will not still end of what all he managed in that one lifespan. But this is a very, very beautiful way. I hope some of you are getting ideas as to what could be the remedy. I mean, we can't interact, unfortunately, live on this, but this is how I want you to see Hahnemann wrote symptom number 1 to symptom number 8. And he would work out and he would write, and this is all in his case notes, that the first symptom, so I'm going to go back and forth because I couldn't show it side by side, that sick, giddy with much irritations. Hahnemann's comment on this first symptom was, many medicines cause vertigo with nausea. I mean, I got a smile when I read this because really, I mean, you open the repertory and this is such a common thing. There's so many medicines, so many medicines. Then he goes to symptom number 2. The following night, about 2 a.m., sour vomiting. He says, Nux and stramonium have sour vomiting, but not at night. So from this big list of number 1 medicines, Nux and stramonium cancelled. Okay. Cocculus and valeriana, they have the night vomiting. See, that's the interesting part. Cocculus and valeriana have the night vomiting, but they are not sour. So again, strike. Elimination. The least noise was painful to him. In the head, he felt vacant, hollow, and confused. In the head, feeling hollow, confused, with symptoms 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, according to Samuel Hahnemann, was covered by Ignatia. But again, not all the symptoms. And the least noise being painful to him is seen in Nux, Ignatia, and Aconite. So he was very clear how he was working. He was extremely focused and he knew when he was taking his history what he was trying to do. This is called quick elimination. All right. Finally, he eliminated all these remedies. I mean, does anybody want to punch in what the remedy could be before I go ahead? Anybody wants to try? I'm waiting for a second or two. Anybody wants to try? Can I see anybody typing? Amit, can you see anybody typing any answers in their chat windows? Yeah, I can see some activity happening in the chat window. That's good. Nobody slept.
I'm definitely not. That's all that I know.
Nobody's typed any answers. Can you see? Because I can't access it from here.
No, somebody.
Okay,
Somebody
Ignatia,
has tried
Nux vomica.
Ignatia.
Yeah, Ignatia, Nux vomica. Okay. More. If we get more answers, it makes it little interesting. Okay, I think we'll go ahead so that. Well, the remedy is most unusual. I mean, I would never say unusual. It is a polycrest, and I say this for students because even today in college, I get this feeling from students and from young homeopaths that when you say give Rustox, Rustox, give Pulsatilla, Pulsatilla. I mean, everybody wants to hunt a new world remedy. Everybody wants to hunt a new Pulsatilla. Everybody wants to hunt a new Rustox. But the beauty of homeopathy is the Rustox that worked way back when Hahnemann started is the same Rustox that's working today, as long as you get the peculiar symptoms. And this is the test of time homeopathy has stood. And the remedy over here is definitely my favorite, and I know a lot of the Homeocon Foundation people's favorite. It is, let me just go ahead, there's some problem with this. It is Pulsatilla. The remedy that Hahnemann chose here was Pulsatilla. Okay, and if you put it in formal repertorization today, you will realize how easy it is. We have computers and we can do this so fast, but Hahnemann would do this in his case books and have his own method of quick analysis. So no, Hahnemann did not spend hours and hours taking case. For him, the totality of the case is what mattered. He defined health and he defined disease. For him, anything that was an aberration, that was peculiar, that was square, that was rare, and that was strange. So in this case, dizziness, vertigo, irritations but not at night, sour irritations, empty feeling in the head, worse by noise, was with a mild, timid disposition, was covered only and only by Pulsatilla. Okay, so this is the beauty, and I think this is an amazing case. There are so many cases in his case book. I could have taken the Bryonia case, but I got partial to this because I found him writing about the elimination of these remedies so beautifully, and I thought it is very important to share. This is a quote from him, and this is what he writes. The investigation in such a slight case of disease, so this is a very typical Hahnemann style of writing, and the choice of the homeopathic remedy for it is very speedily affected by a practitioner who has only little experience in it and who either has the symptoms of the medicine in his memory or who knows where to find it. So for us today, it's the computer. But to give in writing, now this is very interesting, to give in writing all the reasons, pros and cons, which could be perceived by the mind in a few seconds, gives rise to, as we see, tedious prolixity. I mean, when you read something like this, you realize that when our teachers like Habu sir, and when we've seen Dr. Eddie prescribe and make beautiful prescriptions, and the way they break down their cases, Venkat Raman sir, when he's teaching and he tells you, and you as a student get fascinated. This is how it works. They eliminate all this in a matter of seconds. And really, it becomes very difficult to explain why this and why not that. Why this, why not that. Okay, so I think really this is hats off to Hahnemann. A lot of you should take the trouble to read about the life of Hahnemann. It's quite fascinating. It's quite fascinating. You'll realize many aspects of his character. And one of the most important things I want to say for Hahnemann on his birthday, which finished last week, is that we must not immortalize Hahnemann. I genuinely believe that. He was human. I mean, he was a young, struggling physician who decided that he doesn't want to practice inverted bracket allopathy or the medicine of that time. He decided to branch out. He decided to do something revolutionary. He was driven out of cities. He was driven out of towns. When he got popular, the apothecaries, that means the chemists who used to rule the town that time, they threw him out. They got his license cancelled. They made him unpopular. He had no money. He had lots of children. He had mouths to feed, and he was obviously not doing well. And we all know about the famous story of his second marriage, moving to Paris, where there he got royalty, where there he got money, and there he got fame. But these case books of Paris are ones that give you insight that Hahnemann was a very, very practical man. And he was ready to change, he was ready to adapt. The very fact that he rewrote the Organon of Medicine so many times himself in his lifetime shows that he was ready to evolve. Shows that he was ready to accept what he believed earlier was wrong and change. Some homeopaths are extremely rigid and they believe that what he wrote there is gold stone. Well, that's not always true. We know Hahnemann was human. He had his human trait. He used to smoke, so he never wrote about stopping smoking. And this is something I keep telling everybody. We all go on saying Hahnemann gave guidelines, no coffee, no this, probably because coffee never suited Hahnemann. But it seems smoking did, so he never wrote anything about smoking. These are definitely points to ponder about our master. Let us always keep him in memory. He was a great and fantastic man. The more you read about his life, the more fascinated you will get. I urge you all to do so. There are lovely books. The most famous one is by Haley, and there's also one by Bradley called In Search of Later Hahnemann. Highly, highly recommended. On this note, let's go ahead to a simple case, and which I will end with a drug. This is one of my cases which happened during COVID times. A patient is the husband of a doctor. Both were admitted at Dinanath Mangeshkar. They had COVID in the earlier part of COVID, where protocols were not as regulated as they are right now, and everything was let's do as best we can. 56-year-old male admitted at DMH hospital for dropping saturation and comorbidities. He was diabetic, hypertensive, on standard allopathic medication for 10 years, fairly controlled. His HRCT score on admission was 15, which we know goes into moderate towards tending to severe COVID, and his SpO2 was 84% at the time of admission. So this shows that he was not a case that could have been managed at home. He was given remdesivir with all the other protocols. Wife, who was the doctor, was also admitted with him in the same room. And this was the time where fear was rampant. I mean, nobody would be checking patients. Patients would be seen once. They would be kept quite away. Nurses would rarely go in once a day. So I got an SOS call because the wife has been a patient of mine. Doctor, his heart rate is unstable since morning. It has been dropping from 80 a minute to now just 32 a minute. When I am checking it, I can barely get a pulse, soft and perceptible. I tried to speak to the patient, video call, and he couldn't talk to me. And apparently, this is the doctor's word. She says she's trying to get in touch with the consultant, but the consultant wasn't taking her phone. This is what was told to me. So I've just noted what was told to me. The only symptom I got from him, he couldn't move out of weakness, and even sitting up little, I mean, this was the only homeopathic symptom for me, caused him to feel faint. Now, with this much data and the backdrop, I would like the chat box to go live, and let's see if I can get some answers, because the remedy is with a dash, and it caused him his pulse rate to go to a very steady 74 per minute. And even after stopping the remedy within 2-3 doses, it stayed there. It means the remedy had a brilliant action on him. So can I get some answers, please? And if Amit could read them out, and because I can't shift to the chat box from here. Amit, are we getting answers?
One opinion is Bryonia, one opinion is Digitalis, another opinion is Digitalis.
Okay. We have many doctors. Why are such few answers coming?
Carbo Veg,
Okay.
Acid Phos.
Okay, great. All right. We want it.
Stanamimet.
Okay. Okay. Thought process is good. That's great, guys. Everybody, thank you so much. The remedy I chose for this patient was Digitalis, and I gave it in 30C. That's the only potency I have with me of Digitalis in the clinic. And it was sent by an urgent courier, and fortunately, it reached. Fantastic job. Okay. The keynote to catch here was the slowing of the heart rate and the fainting and the weakness on slightest movement, causing him to feel giddy and drowsy. All right. Now, whether this was a good homeopathic prescription or not, I wouldn't say I'm up for judgment, but for the patient, it did magic. And for me, that is magic of homeopathy. All right. Learning from this case is homeopathic remedies can really be magical even in time of crisis. I know even today a lot of young homeopaths are fearful to give homeopathy in any sort of crisis because they are not sure. Simplest example, right from college days, I know, and I keep saying this, some of you will say I'm a stuck record. There are people who still believe that arnica can cause bleeding. You know, that if you give lachesis to a patient, you're going to cause a hemorrhage to happen. I mean, I don't know where this comes from. I mean, sometimes you have a homeopath who writes something, an observation from somewhere, and people make that gold mine. Well, that's not homeopathy, and it should not be how homeopathy should be studied. Homeopathic remedies can be given adjuvantly with good outcomes, because this case was obviously under hospital care. Learning apparently small remedies with distinct sphere of action is very, very important. We all keep talking about the constitutional remedies, the big remedies, not looking at that, but learning these small remedies is an extremely important thing. We will revise the keynotes of this beautiful heart remedy, and coincidentally it happens to be a heart remedy, so I've chosen this, and it was proved by Dr. Samuel Hahnemann. So we'll quickly just do a few strong keynotes and we'll call it a day for here. One thing I wanted to know for those of you who read Herring Guiding Symptoms, and I know Arya sir is very fond of that book, and he was one of the earliest people to inspire me to always at least go through Herring Guiding Symptoms. There is a note under Digitalis, right at the first page, where Herring says that no matter what you talk about the bigger remedies, it's sometimes the small remedies where there are specific actions that have absolutely no substitutes, and Digitalis is one of them. Okay, in the eras of the 1880s to 1950s, I think this was a very useful remedy. Modern medicine has taken giant strides since then. So obviously, the use of remedies like this is not going to be seen by us junior homeopaths. It's going to be nearly impossible. But sometimes you will get an odd case which will need something like this, and you should think of this. So Digitalis purpura is foxglove, common name. I put the picture up, and it comes from the family of Scrophulaceae. It's important to know. How many of you know what is the part that is used to make the remedy? I'm giving you two options. Tell me whether it's the flowers or whether it's the leaves. Can we have the chat box go live quickly, please? Flower or leaf? See, source is very important in homeopathy. You need to know from what the remedy is made. It's ridiculous being a homeopath and if you don't know from where the remedy comes. Is it the flower or is it the leaf? You can just write F or L in the chat box quickly, so Amit can give me a rough idea. 1 answer, 2 answer, 3 answer.
The first answer is flower.
Flower, okay. Yeah, it looks very pretty, the flower, no? At least 10 people should answer. I didn't even give you root and stem as an option.
Three is to two for flower versus leaves.
Okay. Amit, I wish we had that polling thing. That would have been fun.
Hey, it was your talk. You should have organized it.
Okay, anybody more answers?
Flowers over leaves. It
Okay.
seems to be the
See,
general
that's
thing.
human psychology. I put the picture up and the flowers attract your attention. But unfortunately, it's not the flowers, it's the leaves. Okay. The tincture is made from the leaves, and from there the provings have taken place. So I'm very finicky about learning sources. I've always been fascinated by it. It's a habit from Arya sir. So great. So these are the generalities of Digitalis. I'm not going to go through great details, but I think people who love to take down notes and take pictures or screenshots, they can do this. This is like the story of Digitalis. An irregular, weak pulse, intermittent. I mean, each word is important. Weak, irregular, intermittent, and abnormally slow pulse is a pulse of Digitalis. Weakness and dilatation of the myocardium. This is given from Herring's Times. Okay, this line. Auricular fibrillation, so atrial fibrillation. Must walk about is given in generality strangely. Great weakness and sinking of strength. This is like a character of Digitalis. Everything is sinking. Okay, the heart feels sinking. So there's that peculiar sensation as if the heart is suspended by a thread. So, I mean, we laugh when we read such symptoms in homeopathy, but you'll be surprised. Huh? You have patients. And I think the more functional they are on such things, it will be amazing, because very often modern medicine will just dismiss this as psychogenic causes and do nothing, but the patient still suffers. And we have a great role to play. I mean, I know sometimes people say that homeopathy should be only for functional, but that's not true. We do have a great scope. And hypertrophy of liver. Very, very important. Okay. So these are the generalities of Digitalis. Anxiety with fear arising from the stomach. Okay. Anxiety with fear arising. Now, when you read a symptom like this, fear arising from the stomach will remind you of Calcarea carb, will remind you of Kali carb. Fear felt in the stomach, arising from stomach. Do remember, with the big remedies, you also have Digitalis. Very, very important. Okay, and it's a Hahnemannian proved remedy. So don't neglect it. Okay, it has got a lot of good proving symptoms. Fear of death while walking. See, it's the modality that's qualifying. There is not just a fear of death. Fear of death are in probably from A to Z remedies. While walking, there is a fear of death. So we could connect this to cardiac weakness. So there's a fear that something will happen when he's going to walk. Reproaches himself, keeps blaming himself. Suspicious, like lachesis. Weeping ameliorates, like pulsatilla. And a very troubled conscience. A very troubled conscience. So can remind you of cyclamen. So many remedies intersect beautifully. But again, like Hahnemann says, you find the core. You find what is there in Digitalis. Reproaching himself, suspicious, weeping a male with a troubled conscience. A very nice symptom in the head, which is there from the original books, is crashing sounds in the head, like thunderclaps in the head. Now, this could be a very important cardiovascular accident remedy, probably. Okay, I mean, I'm sure at some point, if Amit could take us lecture through symptom through neurology, this is a very good symptom put in the books. A crashing sound in the head. As soon as he puts his head to the pillow, he hears as if thunder is in the head. Pain coming in waves. And this pulling of hair and boring head into the pillow has been marked in the books as cerebrospinal meningitis in children, especially during dentition. So where we always only think of Helleborus, Sina, do remember there is also Digitalis in equal grade marked over there. Pulling hair and boring head into the pillow. All right. Changes in acuteness in the perception of shades of green. This happens in Digitalis poisoning. Even allopaths recognize this. They misjudge the color green. They can't judge the color green very well. great weakness in the stomach, feels he were dying after eating. So when you have a patient who constantly has that khane ke baad or after eating, I feel something is going to happen, something is going to happen, you could think of this remedy. A swollen or a hypertrophic liver with white chalky ashy stools, white chalk like ash stools. So it's not black, it is white chalk like. Okay. Now the very interesting other part where digitalis acts and which is a great homeopathic symptom is the bladder, the prostate and the urethra. There is a golden symptom, and one, I think I'm not just the only homeopath, a lot of homeopaths have used this as a PQRS, where a straw is being thrust back and forth in the neck of a bladder. So sensation of back and forth in the neck of the bladder. So very annoying dysuria. As if, of course, this word as if in homeopathy is amazing. A whole repertory dedicated to it. As if the heart would cease if he moved, opposite to gelsemium. Sinking of the heart, thready pulse, an enfeebled heart without valvular complications. An enfeebled heart without valvular complications. So when we're looking at valvular complications, you could look at Adonis, you could look at Strophanthus, you could look at Laurocerasis. So this is how we differentiate. The fingers go to sleep with coldness of the limbs. Especially the left arm has a special seat of action. Again, cardiac drug, again, angina, again, arrhythmias. Okay, so a lot of things can come from the cardiovascular system and digitalis. Homeopathic symptom is numbness and coldness of limbs. In the lower limbs, a peculiar symptom is as if red hot wires were darting through the legs. See, these words are important. You might suddenly in a 60-year, 70-year career of homeopathy find one patient who specially says that. And like Hahnemann says, you need to know where to find it. Okay. Starting from the sleep as if he is falling. Okay. Something similar to what Kali Carp gets, something very similar to what's written in the Provings of Sulfur. Okay. When he sleeps, he gets a feeling as if he is falling from the height. Dropsy of the organs, because naturally heart not pumping well, leading to right heart failure, leading to liver congestion, leading to you have dropsy. Great coldness of the skin, marble like coldness of the skin. Again, this is connected to heart pathology. So if you go back to pathology, you can connect a lot of these symptoms for digitalis. So this is my talk on digitalis. Thank you all for waiting so patiently. My always take home message is spread the light of homeopathy always. I hand over to Amit to give us concluding remarks and we could call it a day. And I hope you've all enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sachin. That was wonderful, taking us back to Hahnemann and his times in Paris, and opening the first page of that book for the first time for me. So hopefully I'll borrow it from you, and I hope everybody reads it. It sounds fascinating. So we are almost coming to the end of our session today. My thanks to all for coming. My thanks to Dr. Venkatraman sir, Dr. Eddy sir, Dr. Arya sir, Dr. Habu sir, Dr. Solanki madam. Thanks, Dr. Milind Phadke. I hope we can do a few more lectures of yours on the ECG. Dr. Ashwini Joshi joined us for a bit, and upon popular request, I've requested her to take a few more lectures for us on diabetes and medicine. So hopefully we'll come up with something soon, and see you all for that session. Thanks a lot and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.